Hi, I'm Anitra Brown, editor of the New Orleans Tribune, and this is TRIB Talk, our social media talk show. Thank you so much for joining us. And we're joined right now by Dr. Raynard Sanders. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Sanders.
Thank you for inviting me.
Great. So I have you here. I want to talk about a couple of things. One of them is the return of the New Orleans Imperative. And I'm sure many of our followers and listeners remember the New Orleans Imperative from a while back. I want you to tell us, remind us, what the New Orleans Imperative was, the radio show, and where can folks find you now?
Okay, well, first off, thanks again for inviting me. The New Orleans Imperative started in 2009, and I broadcasted for 7 years, and it focuses on public education post-Katrina, really telling the story about what went on in New Orleans, most of the information that was not reported by the mainstream media. And I broadcasted for 7 years with that on WBOK. Now I'm broadcasting on a new station, a community station called WHIV FM. It's about 3 or 4 years old, and it's all talk radio.
Okay.
And they are part of a national network of radio stations across the country that talk about social justice, and that's what the radio station is dedicated to: social justice, LGBT's rights, women's rights, all issues that affect us, our community. And I broadcast on WHIV 102.3 on Mondays from 1 to 2 p.m. every Monday. Really excited about that, to get back on the air and put the issues back out there that are mostly ignored for the large part at this point.
And again, the New Orleans Imperative focuses on public education, the public education landscape here in Orleans Parish, and those are the things that we talk
in New Orleans, we take on national topics too, because some of the same things that are happening here in New Orleans is happening across the country. New Orleans is the largest percentage of charter schools in the country, and has been very, very egregious to the local community in developing them and ignoring those communities, and really have not performed well academically and operationally.
Right.
So we report a lot on that. We do have some national topics that we talked about, like this past Monday we talked about school shootings.
Right, okay.
We'll be talking about privatization across the country, school choice, not just here in New Orleans, but the way it plays out in other communities.
Okay, kind of a national landscape
of
what's happening in public education. So I want to thank you for taking this opportunity to get back out on the airwaves. I think that one of the things, I know here at the New Orleans Tribune, we have tried to talk about from a critical standpoint what has taken place in public education, not only here, but again, like you said, nationally. And so it's so important to have those voices, people who aren't just drinking the Kool-Aid, folks who are looking critically at what's happening in our communities here in New Orleans, across the state, across the nation, as it relates to public education and some of the reform movements. So it's been, I'm so glad that you're back on the airwaves.
And also, in addition to, giving information, we give voice to the voiceless.
Gotcha.
And that's what I have historically done throughout the tenure of the New Orleans Imperative, is those communities that had no voice, that the media ignored, and those parents, and those kinds of things. We have really been a venue where people, students and parents could talk about what's going on in their community and how they have been disenfranchised from the public education process.
Right, absolutely, because if you... there's so few places where their voices can be heard. That's why the New Orleans Imperative has been important. And speaking of voices being heard, you have a new book that is out. It is called 21st Century Jim Crow Schools, The Impact of Charters on Public Education.
Yes.
And you're one of the authors of this book, along with David Stovall and Torinda White, where each of you are kind of looking at what's taking place in your respective communities, or communities across the nation: New Orleans, New York, and Chicago. Talk a little bit about your contribution to this book.
Well, that particular book, we have been talking about it for about 3 or 4 years, and we finally got a group of authors that could really write from a grassroots perspective about what went on in 3 particular cities that have had privatization movements. All of them a little bit differently, but all of them give you the same results.
Right.
Poor performance, disenfranchise the community and get rid of teachers. And essentially, the book, each one of us writes a chapter. I write a chapter on New Orleans and talk about how the reforms unfolded and how it came to be. Most of which was not reported.
Right.
So I look at it academically, I look at it financially, I look at it from a policy standpoint, and I also tell stories that are partly told in terms of school communities and what happened, and how we have been left out of the public education process, and we basically have a private school system now that's publicly funded.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that I talk about New Orleans. David talks about Chicago, and none of them happen as quickly as New Orleans. You know, they all happen differently because of different environments and different political aspects. Here in New Orleans, as a result of Katrina, they were able to flip it quickly. You know, when we were depopulated and everything. In Chicago, much slower process, but just as egregious. And in New York, same kind of thing where we have reformers taking over, and that's reformers without the S instead of the cash sign, taking over and basically housing kids, not offering quality education to them, and just disregarding the parents, and the kids become commodities essentially. So it just shows how those stories unfolded in 3 different cities in other parts of the country.
And again, it's so important to kind of talk about the things that aren't being talked about in mainstream media, that aren't being talked about, I think, in a true, authentic way that reflects what's happening to parents, students, community, in the places where decisions are getting made. Real quick, Dr. Sanders, could you tell me just your take on where we're at right now in terms of public education?
Terrible situation. Educational opportunities for poor and minority kids are probably at the lowest that it has ever been. And we have no control over it, right? We are not participating in the process at the school site. There's no mandated parental or community participation at the charter board site, and we have passed some legislation that basically locks us out, so to speak. So therefore, we have a small group of people that don't look like the majority of this population that's running the schools that have no expertise and no interest of educating poor and minority kids. We have pockets of education where you can get an excellent education if you are, academically talented, white, and you can get great education. But for the majority of the kids, this is a very poor city. They are being migrated across the city. We don't know budgets. We have nothing to do with contracts, and equally as important, they are housed by people who are not trained as teachers. And there was a great move after Katrina to eliminate the African American teacher. And so there's a lot of things that's going on in schools today that are not researched, not educationally sound, and in many ways is criminal. Now, how do we get out of this? It's really going to take a while to do, merely because it is now codified in the law. So it is not a good place. It's not a good place for educated child here in New Orleans, and beautiful buildings, but nothing going on inside.
Wow. And you know what? I did my guest a disservice before we begin. I need to say that Dr. Sanders is a veteran educator, former principal, and now a very strong education advocate. So the things that you're doing, the work that you're doing between the books and the radio show are important, and you're coming from a place of both experience and passion. So talk to us a little bit, really quick, before we go, about the new book that you have coming out in a short while.
The new book talks a little bit more extensively, as I mentioned earlier. The 21st century Jim Crow schools is just a chapter.
Okay.
The new book goes much more extensively into what happened in New Orleans and looks at it from a historical perspective.
Gotcha.
So while I do report on the symptoms That means, charter school boards, all these big salaries, teachers getting fired. I really also focus on how it historically matches with history here in New Orleans, and not really any great effort to educate African Americans. And also, it talks about the real purpose of the reforms in this country, and that is to control resources, all resources, and to decide which kids go to which schools.
Gotcha.
And so it's a much deeper look into that. And the name of that book is The Coup d'etat of New Orleans Public Schools, Money, Power, and the Illegal Takeover of the Public School System. And that should be out later on this year.
Okay, well, we look forward to seeing that when it comes out and reading that. And again, really quick, where can folks hear the New Orleans Imperative, time and station?
Mondays at 1 p.m. and 102.3 WHIV radio station FM. Mondays 1 p.m. 102.3 FM.
Okay, 1 p.m. on Mondays, 102.3 FM. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr.
Thank you.
Sanders.
Anytime.
And thank you for joining us. Remember, you can catch TRIB Talk on our Facebook page and our YouTube channel. Thank you for joining us this week.